Hey everybody, it's Mason. It's been a while. I thought it'd be fun to make a video, a little bit of a tips and tricks, I guess, things that I've kind of learned over the course of doing some prompt-based writing contests over the past year. I have not done as much writing as I would have liked to this year. I really let some of my novel writing and short story writing kind of fall to the wayside. But thankfully, I have been doing some writing via these, writing competitions, and they've been an amazing help. I think that if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have done any writing at all. So I really credit them with, helping me continue to try to hone my craft and become a better writer. And I have learned a lot. And so, I love, sharing some of the things that I've learned. And so I wanted to do that in a video form today. So it's been a little over a year since I started joining some of these like prompt-based writing competitions online, like New York City Midnight, Writing Battle, most prevalently, and a few others like Twisted Tournament. I'll go ahead and really quickly throw up my kind of data. This is basically every contest that I've done over the past year or more. And, things have gone fairly well. I'm really, really stoked with how I've improved and how some of the results have panned out. I'm most excited about the Forest and Fawn, 8th place finish there. I was really, really proud of that. As well as with Writing Battle, just being able to consistently, make it into the final showdown and improving my place along the way. I still yet to, of course, win one of these, as you can see, but that's extraordinarily difficult. And so I am just, happy and proud of, the steps that I've made to improve. And, I've learned a few little things along the way. And so I wanted to share some of those in this video. So please know, first and foremost, before I get into any of the details of this is all just what works for me. This is just my personal opinion. And I think that the main thing with becoming a better writer is forming your own opinions, forming your own style, forming your own process. I really am not the biggest fan of any sort of writing advice or tips and tricks online that are super prescriptive. Like, I think that writing is just too nebulous for that. There's too much, gray area. And I just don't think that, saying you must do these 5 things or don't do these 5 things, I see these types of videos online and I just don't think they're always the most helpful. I think that, like I said, there's just so much room for, figuring out your own process and things that you like. And so I would highly recommend, kind of forming your own opinions on a lot of this, any of this stuff that I give, discard what you don't like and keep what you do, or discard it all, whatever works best for you. Forming your own process and things that you like is key, I think. So first and foremost, we're kind of going to go through the different steps in kind of a linear order of any sort of writing contest. Now, I'm specifically referring to like prompt-based writing contests because, general writing contests where you're just submitting a story and, the judges read it and they pick the best stories they like. Those are great. And I've entered a few of these contests a long time ago in the past, but I'm more referring to prompt-based writing contests where you don't know what you're writing about beforehand. You get prompts and then you write the story within a certain time frame. That's more what I'm kind of referring to in this video. So I think the first, thing is just knowing what you want to get out of the contest. This can kind of reframe how you think about the contest specifically. I mean, for example, if you are for a contest just to get feedback and just to improve as a writer, then if, that's literally it, then I'd say disregard a lot of this advice, disregard a lot of the writing advice you hear online. Just write what you want, write in the own style that you prefer, write things that sound fun to you, and you'll definitely improve as a writer via the feedback, via all these different things. So if that's, your goal setting out, then yeah, that's perfectly fine. That's wonderful. And so, for me, with writing contests, I really like the competitive aspect of it. I really like I want to win. I know maybe that sounds shallow or naive, but, I really enjoy that part of it. And that doesn't mean I'm not, supportive of the other people in the writing contest. I am the most supportive of my fellow writers and want to uplift and encourage people at every avenue possible. But at the same time, I want to win these contests and I want to do the best that I can. And so, with that in mind, I want to try to write stories that will do well in contests, and which kind of leads me to my second point. So the first point, knowing what you want to get out of it. What is your goal in mind? If your goal, like I said, is just to simply improve as a writer, you do not care at all about the placements or the results, then shoot, just, do your thing. You'll improve. You will definitely improve and get better, and you'll enjoy the things that you're writing. But if you actually, really, really care about the placement and how you finish in, some of these writing contests, then some of these tips might be a little more applicable. So the second piece of tip would be, contest stories are not stories, for kind of lack of a better way to put that. The idea being that the types of stories that you submit to a contest are not the same types of stories that you probably that would succeed in a contest, I should say, are not the types of stories that would necessarily succeed in like a literary magazine submission or something like that. I think with there's many differences between the two. They're not night and day. And a great story is a great story, regardless if it's a contest or a literary magazine. But I think certain concepts, such as like ambiguity, does not always play as well in contests. I think that having really strong conclusions to your stories goes much better in contests rather than literary magazines having a very ambiguous ending. Like I said, just doesn't always play as well in stories. Subtlety in contest stories, I should say. Subtlety doesn't always play as well in contest stories. So these are some things to keep in mind. Now, those of course can be, great techniques to employ in contest stories. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I've seen plenty of stories that have won contests that, are subtle, that have vague endings. This is not all 100%. This is not all gospel. This is just in general the types of things that I've seen and the types of experiences that I have had. So it's good to kind of keep that in mind when you're, entering these contests. I know there's, like I said, these kind of tie together, the idea of knowing what you want out of the contest and keeping in mind that contest stories are different from stories, because basically, if you just want to write you just want to express yourself the way that you want, and the way that you want to express yourself often, personifies itself in these very cryptic, poetic, subtle stories. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Like, absolutely, do it. Like, I crave more stories that are not, slapping the reader over the head with its, theme or things like that. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind that these types of stories don't fare as well in contests. So if you care about results, maybe tend a little bit less towards that. But then at the same time, are you truly expressing yourself in the way that you want to? So it's a really tough balance to strike, and I totally understand that. So just, keeping in mind what you want out of the contest is huge. So the third tip I have is going in with confidence. And this is so much easier said than done, of course, but I think that confident writing makes itself evident to the reader, and not confident writing also makes itself evident to the reader. And I know it's hard to just say like, oh, okay, well, I'll just be confident now. I know it's not that simple, obviously, but there's those like, I don't know the exact study, but the idea being that like some scientific study that proved that if you look in the mirror and you like smile at yourself in the mirror, even if you're not in a good mood, it can somehow, raise some of your chemical levels or whatever, and can improve your mood even marginally. And I think the same thing goes with writing. If just telling yourself, hey, I can do this. I am a good writer. Even looking back on some of your past successes and saying, look what I've done. I can do it again. And just trying to build confidence within yourself is huge when you're writing. And this applies to more than just contest writing. It applies to almost any facet of writing, is just going in with confidence, whether or not in, deep down you actually believe it, but at least just convincing yourself that you can do this is huge. And I think that it, like it says, like I said, it personifies itself in the writing. And I think that you're more willing to be bold and take interesting, dynamic, stylistic choices. You're more willing to try different things. And I think that sometimes with, contest stories, having something that can stand out and choosing a bold way to tell a story can really, help you succeed. And you're not always so willing to take these bold choices when you're, hesitant or not confident. And I at least know for me, the stories that have done best are the ones that I've written with confidence. It's not that easy. I understand. There's many times that I've written stuff and I don't feel good about it, or I don't feel confident. So this is just as much for me as anybody else. I totally get that. So, but going in with confidence really, really helps. Number 4, this one's kind of specific to certain contests. It's being strategic with your prompt rerolls. There are some contests like Twisted Tournament or Writing Battle where you can reroll your prompts, or you can change your prompts to alter them a few times to get to something that you like. I definitely say, use this. Think about this. Be very conscious about how you're setting up your prompts to help you succeed. More often than not, I like to try to find prompts that are more general, things that are very wide reaching. Basically, if I have an idea for maybe where a story is going to go, I want prompts that will allow the story to kind of branch in a lot of different directions based off of the types of things that I want to do with it. So I'm trying to think of an example. In some contests, they have an object prompt. And if the object is, for example, I know one I've seen in Writing Battles a lot, it's a fishing pole, right? It's very specific. Fishing pole. If a fishing pole is involved in a story, that usually requires fishing, which requires a body of water, which requires, fish. It doesn't require all of that, obviously. I've seen amazing stories written with the fishing pole prompt, but it definitely makes it a bit trickier, and you have to kind of cater the story around it in a way. And I think that more general prompts, like a coffee mug or anything, something that is a little more general, something that applies in a wider variety of circumstances, can be more helpful. I definitely try to go towards those, but at the same time, like I said, this is all very vague, and whatever you like, whatever you tend towards, if there's a certain object or a certain setting or a certain theme that you have experience with in the past, or that really well, even if it's really, really specific. For example, I love weather and storms, and I love to write about, storms and stuff like that. If I were to get the prompt of tornado or something, it's very specific. It really, you have to cater your story around it. But at the same time, I would love that. I know a lot about tornadoes and storms, and so I could feel like I could write a really good story around that. So just, whatever you feel comfortable with, whatever you think allows you a lot of wiggle room is what I would kind of tend towards. So just, I err towards more general prompts, but at the same time, I've seen really specific prompts that have done well. So it's not, a story killer or anything, but I just try to leave myself as many options as possible. So be strategic with your rerolls. And so now we're getting into the actual story itself. I could give, a ton of general tips. This type of stuff that I said is kind of prescriptive that you can find online. Vary your sentence length, use good grammar, all, different things like this. But, honestly, I don't really want to get too into, all of that. I think that there's tons of resources online that you can actually improve your, story writing itself. It's the most mystical, the most difficult part of any of it anyway, is the actual writing of the story itself, the plot. And so the one thing that I will talk about is how contest stories sometimes, like I said, are different from the type of stories you submit to a literary magazine. And I want to emphasize what I think is really important to spend a lot of time on and put a lot of care into with your contest stories. And there's 2 things to this. So the first is character/character voice. I think that, above plot, above setting, above many different elements of storytelling, I think that character, specifically when it comes to contests, is the most important thing. It's the way that your reader connects to your story, really, really quickly. It's kind of like you see the humanness in another character. You see a part of yourself in that character when you're reading about it, and you instantly are kind of sucked into the story based off of that. And so I think that having a strong, character voice really, really helps. Having strong characters really, really helps. It's always kind of where I try to start the story, is try to decide who this character is and how is the reader going to connect to the character. And I think that sometimes we think about we need to write strong characters. We sometimes will think, oh, well, I need to write like a really wild character, or a really how do I put this, like a really eccentric character, or somebody that's really, really memorable. It's not always that case. I think just writing a character that is relatable in some ways, and maybe even, that doesn't mean a character that is a good person. It's, we all have dark parts in ourselves, and seeing those dark parts in other characters is another way that readers can connect to the character. And so I think that learning how to really hone a character voice and how to emphasize character is just the biggest part of any contest story, and most stories in general. I think it's really how the reader connects to it. I think that you can have the most beautiful prose, the most incredible scene setting, the most interesting plot, and the story will just fall flat if not for character. Where on the other hand, I think that if you have really strong character, you can almost disregard some of these other aspects of storytelling and still have a great story. And though, of course, the best stories are the ones that are nailing every single one of these points, of course. And I also want to mention, too, that some stories, I'm sure you can think of some that pop into your mind, are so well written with the setting, with the description, that like the setting is its own character in some ways. And so that's kind of a workaround for that, I guess, in some ways. So character voice is so vital, and that's usually the thing I try to emphasize most. And then lastly is the ending to your story. This is one of the things I talked about, contest stories being different. Contest stories, I really think, are best when they're neatly wrapped up in a bow, when you have a really strong ending that ties everything back together. I think that this goes a really long way. Like I said, this is all just my opinion. This is all very, not black and white at all. And there are tons of stories that have done well in contests that have vague or, endings that feel like they lead to something bigger. But in my opinion, I think the best way to, ensure you have a great story that can hopefully succeed is just with a strong ending. And there's tons of ways to do that. Maybe a twist at the end. Twists are hard because twists are a great way to end, a short story for a contest. But the hard part with twists is sometimes it feels unearned. And so you need to make the reader feel like they kind of earn the twist. And, it's the kind of idea of you read a whole story and you get invested in these characters and you can invest in all this. And then you get to the end and you go, wait, it was all a dream or something like that. These types of things, it needs to feel earned. It needs to feel like incorporated within the plot in some way. And there's plenty of great ways to do that. And so, twist is a great way to do it. I think that just bringing the plot full circle is a great way to do that, either with some sort of feel good or some sort of gut punch. I like towards kind of like clever callback lines. This is something I like to do, is like use a line at the end that kind of calls back to something that was said more subtly earlier in the story, that really kind of, this line, whatever it is, can kind of be seen in a different light now that you've understood the story and understood the plot. I like those types of things. And so I think that ending the story on a really strong ending is really key as well. So like I said, the two most important parts of any story to me are character/character voice and a strong ending. My next tip is don't be afraid to recycle material. Now, obviously, for these prompt-based writing contests, you want to write fresh stories. It's not allowed within the rules for most of these stories to, refresh any sort of other story that you already have written. So that's not what I'm referring to. I'm more referring to lines that you like, or character types that you like, or tropes that you like and have experience with. I mean, it's a fresh contest. And like I said, this really ties in with the very first point of knowing what you want to get out of the contest. If you want to just push yourself, if you want to expand your horizons as a writer and try different things, experiment, then do it. Absolutely do that. But at the same time, also, if you just want to succeed, if you just want to place well, then don't be afraid to recycle some of your material. If you have a specific line of description that you like from something else that you wrote that you threw away, never used, or whatever, one of your darlings that you killed, don't be afraid to bring it back. Or if you have a certain type of character that you like, definitely don't be afraid to refresh it. I like to write a lot of my stories nowadays in first person, and there's a few stories I've written for contests in third person, but like for example, I just will often just be my default way of doing it, because I'm not always trying to push myself in these contests to become a better writer. I know, as shallow or strange as that sounds, I think that a lot of my improvement comes naturally just by doing it and getting practice and just writing stories. And so I don't always necessarily feel the need to like push myself. So I'll just write in first person because I'm comfortable with it, because I feel like it gives me the best chance of, writing a story that will succeed in the contest. So, don't being afraid, like I said, to recycle different things that you've used in the past, or, different types of characters that you tend towards, tropes. Don't be afraid to do it. It doesn't hurt. Next, kind of ties in with this in some ways, is leaning into your strengths. With contests, again, I keep reiterating this point, knowing what you want out of the contest. If you want to stretch yourself, then try something new. Absolutely do it. But then don't be, surprised if the story doesn't, happen to do well, because you're still learning a new style. You're still learning something new that you're trying out. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But, just being aware of what you want out of it. And so I think that, leaning into your strengths, if you really care about placing well, is huge. Doing the things that you like to do. Like I said, writing in first person is something that I like to do. I like to write kind of quirky Southern characters. And so that will be in a lot of my stories. I feel like it's some of the things that I do best. And so those are the things that I'm going to emphasize and lean into. And if you want to stretch yourself, do it. There's nothing wrong with that at all, like I said. But often I will try to lean on my strengths, especially if I really want to place well in the contest. I'll do the things that I know have succeeded in the past and that I, know how to do well. The next tip would be to trust your gut. This is so ambiguous, so vague. It really doesn't mean much at all to anybody. But you kind of get where I'm going with it. The idea being, when you have certain little inclinations about where the story should go, even if your beta readers disagree, even if you logically think like this shouldn't work, if your heart is telling you that this idea that you have, or this direction that you're going with the story, or this stylistic choice that you're taking, if your heart is telling you that you're onto something, then really press into that, and don't be afraid to, do something bold and go a direction that you feel like it's going. I think that sometimes as writers, we always need reasons for why our story is or isn't working. We're reading it and we're like, something just isn't quite clicking. It's just missing something. And sometimes we want to, before we change it, we have to figure out what it is that's missing. And I feel like sometimes we don't always need to have that answer of what is wrong with it or what is working with it. It's just not working, or it just is working. And so trying to just listen to your gut, listening to that like internal radar, that writer voice inside your head that's telling you that this is good or this is bad, and trying to, drown out that voice when possible, but at the same time lean into it when you feel like it's telling you that something's working or something's not working. It's hard to do. I get it. Next is be a storyteller, not a writer. I think that this is a typical thing for any, sort of story outside of just contests, is the idea of, sometimes you'll read stories and it'll feel like, okay, a writer wrote this. A writer is being a writer. And I think that sometimes we can be, and this is myself included as much as anyone, is that sometimes we learn these techniques, or we learn, we often have bigger vocabularies as writers. And so we really try to flex that, or try to lean in too much to being a writer and not enough about just giving people the story. And judges that are reading these stories, whether it's something that's like peer judged or if it's professionally judged, regardless, at the end of the day, they just want to read a good story. And I think that sometimes we as writers can really lean too much into the technique and forget the whole, storytelling aspect of it. And so, I don't know, that's kind of a vague piece of advice, and it's a lot easier said than done, of course. Next up is read the winning stories. This is huge. I sometimes will see these contests and everybody will talk about all these different stories that'll enter the contest, especially with like writing battle. There'll be debrief and people will read other people's stories and they'll read 10s to 20s to, hundreds of these stories and comment on them and leave feedback, which is fantastic. But then the contest is over and people don't read the winning stories. And I think that if you really want to improve, especially if it's a certain contest that you're not quite sure what sort of stories do best, like definitely read the winning stories. There's a reason they won. There's a reason that they succeeded. And I think that looking at the best stories that have succeeded in contests and analyzing what they did well is really, really key for improvement. And so I would highly, emphasize reading the winning stories for these tournaments. Anytime I'm entering a new contest that I've never seen before, I'll go back to like last year's contest or, whatever the last contest was for it and read the winning stories to see what, sort of things do well. And obviously we're not going to take these stories and copy, many of the ideas, but just seeing like what sort of techniques are employed by the winning stories. Like I said, there's a reason that they won. It is so difficult to win these contests. And I think that, like I said, learning from what has worked in the past is really, really key. So I would highly, recommend that. Last is in regards to feedback at the end of a lot of these stories. I think that feedback is a whole other can of worms in its own right. I think that feedback can be really difficult. Sometimes feedback can be bad. Sometimes feedback can be good. I think the key with feedback is just taking everything with a grain of salt, trying your best to wear thick skin, not taking everything to heart. I think too, it's also good to listen to what, the feedback is actually saying if you don't like it. I mean, I think it really depends on the type of person that you are. I think that some people will take feedback too personally. This is me. I definitely take feedback too personally sometimes. And then there's some people that will get feedback and any negative critique they'll disregard as the reader not knowing how to read it or the reader not understanding. They'll look at, a piece of feedback that they received at the end of a contest from a judge or a peer, and they'll go, well, and the piece of feedback will say something along the lines of like, I didn't understand this character. I didn't understand what happened here. And, as a reader, sometimes as a writer, we'll get those types of feedback and we'll go, well, yeah, it's right there on the text. You should have seen that this happened there and X happened to Y. Why didn't they get this? As the judge, they obviously didn't read it or they obviously didn't pay enough attention. And so, on the other side of that spectrum, those types of, writers, sometimes it can be helpful to realize there maybe is something to that feedback. Maybe just reiterating something once or twice, especially if it's kind of complicated concept or some sort of character interaction, really making sure to drive it home. Like I said, I think subtlety doesn't always play the best in these contests. So that can be part of it. And then if you're on the other end, like I said, like me, that I'm very sensitive, it's just, not taking the feedback to heart, trying to wear thick skin, taking the feedback, of course, into consideration, but also realizing that, it's not the end of the world if one person doesn't like my story. All right. And the very last thing I have is not tying your self-worth into the results. And this goes two different ways. I think that, when we hear this, we often think of, if a contest doesn't go well, right? And we don't succeed or we, our story crashes and burns, and the idea of, not tying our self-worth into the results. And that is absolutely true. Your worth is not at all defined. Your worth as a writer, your worth as a person is not at all defined in the results of these contests. Like I said, these contest stories are different from the types of stories that succeed in other areas, in literary magazines, in publications, in novels. They're different and they're just different. And maybe the types of stories that you like to write, that you are best at, are the types of stories that don't quite mesh with the contest vibe. And that's all right. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And I think that, you just have to remind yourself that your worth is not tied in with these results. And like I said, it goes the opposite direction as well, though. Like if you succeed in a contest and the contest does go well, it's really easy to let yourself get overexcited, to inflate your own sense of self-worth. And I think with writing, that's just this toughest part of it. I talked about this in another video about like managing your expectations and trying to embrace the highs, celebrate your wins, be proud of yourself for what you've accomplished, but also not get too, like I said, ego inflated, not believe that this is going to happen every single time now, not believe that things are always going to be, perfect forever, because in the very next contest, something different could happen. The result could go the opposite way, and you might be down in the dumps again. I think it's good to feel the highs. It's good to feel the lows, but don't ever let yourself get too high or too low. It's the type of thing I try to remind myself, though, of course, like I said a million times in this video, it's easier said than done. This was very rambly, I know, very vague. I'm not giving a ton of concrete stuff, and that's kind of the goal. I know, writing is figuring out your own process and what works. If you liked any of this, content, like I said, take it and please feel free to disregard the rest. This is just my opinion, my thoughts on some of these contests. They're a lot of fun, and if you've never entered any sort of prompt-based writing contest, I highly encourage you to do so. It's a blast. It's a great time. And I will continue to do these, and hopefully I can, post some more content about that type of stuff in the future. This channel is just a fun little project that I just, whenever I'm feeling like talking about something, I'll do it. So please don't expect any, regular uploads or anything. It's just how I'm, expressing myself online here about writing. So thank you so much for watching. Like I said, very rambly. I appreciate you sticking with me if you made it this far. Yeah, I hope you all keep writing, have a good time, enjoy yourself, express yourselves, and keep doing it. Bye.